Hi there, everybody. Welcome to the Unfolding Restoration. My name's Anthony Sweat. I'm so excited and grateful to get to share this time with you. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope that it edifies and enlightens and informs you as you seek to understand the unfolding restoration. The point of this whole series is to look at how the restoration unfolded bit by bit, line upon line, as it was revealed primarily to the prophet Joseph Smith. However, today in this lesson, we're going to look at this question of the succession in the church after Joseph Smith's death. Sometimes it's called the succession crisis, which is, in my opinion, a really strong word. I'm not sure I would call it the succession crisis more than the succession confusion. It was a crisis in that the church was at a pivotal time in trying to figure out who should be in charge. And there were a lot of different options, a lot of viable options. But the bigger way to look at it was the succession question. The reason why I don't necessarily call it a crisis is because the majority of the church came to the same conclusion, and that was to sustain Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and to follow them. However, that's easy to say in hindsight. The trajectory of history looks inevitable from you and I who stand at our current positions in the present. But if you and I had been in Nauvoo in the summer of 1844, it wouldn't have seemed inevitable. We likely would have had questions and concerns. As I mentioned in a previous video, sometimes people say, why didn't Joseph make it more clear who should lead the church after his death? I personally think Joseph made it very clear. If we had been living in Nauvoo, almost all of us would have known that if Joseph Smith were to die, that the next person who should be president of the church should be not Brigham Young. It should be Hyrum Smith. Hyrum Smith was the co-president or assistant or associate president of the church, who acted according to section 124 of the Doctrine and Covenants in concert with Joseph Smith as prophet, seer, and revelator. And so the reason why it became a big question was because on June 27th, 1844, both Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith, the president and co-president, were both killed at the same day, on the same time, leading the church to wonder who should be in charge. The questions that were at hand, the options, were many. Should it be one of the counselors in the First Presidency? In particular, should it be Sidney Rigdon, who had been Joseph's first counselor for at least 11 years? Should it be another counselor in the First Presidency? Should it be, as Emma Smith wanted, William Marks, the Nauvoo stake president, who mainly Emma Smith seemed to want William Marks because William Marks's conservative doctrinal views, in particular his views against and opposing plural marriage, aligned better with Emma's own views. Should it be a Smith child? Should it be familial? In particular, should it be Joseph Smith's son, Joseph Smith III? Or should it be the patriarch of the church, the oldest Smith at the time in the Joseph Smith family, which was Joseph's little brother, William Smith, who also happened to be a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles? William Smith was very erratic, but that was definitely a viable option. Should it be somebody like James Strang, who came rolling in with a supposed letter saying that Joseph Smith had appointed him to be the leader of the church should he die? Maybe it should be another apostle. Just because Brigham was the president of the 12, does that mean he should become president of the church? There's some indications that maybe Willard Richards was trying to kind of vie himself and position himself as the leader of the 12, or that the 12 could have picked somebody else like Parley P. Pratt, who was very popular. All I'm saying is that there were options. We haven't even talked about the Council of 50. Should the Council of 50 make the decision? Who were the council put in charge of trying to lead the kingdom of God as a whole? Well, those are a lot of the questions with the succession. And in this video, we're going to talk about the succession question, these options, what happened. In particular, we're also going to talk about the different restoration branches, different restoration movements in churches that have resulted after Joseph Smith's death, most of them after Joseph Smith's death, so that we can understand them. Then we'll look at the succession, how the succession works in the church today, and the succession to Brigham Young leading the church west. We have a lot to cover in this video, and I hope to do it well. I want to kick off, though, with a little personal story. I one time was asked to go speak at a conference out in the Midwest. It was a Book of Mormon conference in Missouri, and it was a great experience. It was not only for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, hyphenated. It was also for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, capital D, no hyphen. It was also for members of the Community of Christ and the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ, which sometimes are seen as the same but can also be different. It was also for people who were part of other restoration branches and movements, people who are known as Bickertonites or Hedrichites, sometimes Whiteites or others. Now, I don't say those pejoratively because one of the things that was fun was while I was at this conference, somebody said to me, "Who are you?" And I introduced myself, and they said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Brigham Young University," or "I'm from Utah." And they said, "Oh, you're a mountain saint." And I kind of smiled, and I said, "I've never been called a mountain saint before." And they said, "Oh, yeah, that's what we call everybody who went west and followed Brigham, or mountain saints." And they said, we're called prairie saints. We're the Midwest saints who didn't go west. And then they said, "Sometimes we call you Brighamites." Kind of like how that person over there is a Josephite who followed Joseph Smith III, or this person is a Bickertonite or a Whiteite. And it was just so fun. It was so fun to talk and be with those. And I want to say up front in this video, I'm so grateful for what sometimes is collectively called our cousins in the Restoration, people who believe in the prophetic mission of Joseph Smith and in the divine mission of our Savior, Jesus Christ, even though we might belong to different Restoration churches. And for those who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, hyphenated lowercase d, because that's different than the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, no hyphen capital D, that are sometimes called Strangites. Sometimes we can, this might be an area where we need to do better. I'm even saying that of myself. If I could share a personal experience, I one time was in Nauvoo and talking with a member of the Community of Christ, and was kind of having some difficult feelings. As you know, sometimes like strangers are easy to get along with because you're so different, but it's your cousins or your family members who you share the same DNA that sometimes you have the hardest feelings towards because you come from the same source, yet you see things so differently. And as I was having some of these difficult feelings that arise in me, I felt the Holy Ghost rebuke me, if I can be honest. And the rebuke that I felt was that the Spirit said to me, "How many people on this earth," the Spirit led me through some questions like this in my mind, "how many people on this earth believe in God?" And I thought, well, the great majority do. And then the next question that came to my mind was, "How many people on this earth believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God?" And I said, "Billions." And then here was the next question. "How many people on this earth believe that Joseph Smith is Jesus Christ's servant in the latter days and the prophet of the Restoration?" And I was like, very few, 1%, maybe 1/10 of 1% of the global population. And then the Spirit kind of softened me and said, "This person you're talking to is part of the people who believe that Joseph is his prophet, that the Book of Mormon is true, that Jesus is the Christ, and that God our Father is our Father in heaven." And I saw that person, instead of being in conflict with them, more as my brother in the Restoration. I hope we can feel that way up front as I talk about different Restoration branches that exist out in the church today. But I do also want to pose a question in particular for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that is that I don't actually believe. Sometimes we use this logic that if you will read the Book of Mormon and know that the Book of Mormon's true, then we follow down some logic. You will know that, therefore, Jesus is the Christ, that Joseph Smith was his prophet, and that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is true. I believe those first two steps in the logical syllogism, but not the third, simply because I could show you a million people in these various Restoration branches who don't belong to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but they still believe the Book of Mormon is true and that Joseph Smith was a prophet and that Jesus is the Christ. So the question I want to pose to you is, not only how do you know that Joseph Smith is a prophet of God, but how do you know that Brigham Young is a prophet of God, and that he and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles were the rightful successors to the keys of the kingdom, to the keys to continue the authorized ordinances of the Church of Jesus Christ in these latter days? It's an important question. And at the end, I'll maybe return to why I believe that Brigham Young was a prophet of God and that therefore the keys have continued down at the time of this recording, this video, to Russell M. Nelson as the one who possesses and is authorized to exercise all the priesthood keys in this church. I want you to reflect on that as I go through this succession question video and the role of prophetic succession through Brigham Young today. Well, when Joseph Smith was killed, the New York Herald presumptuously predicted, quote, "The death of the modern Muhammad will seal the fate of Mormonism. They cannot get another Joe Smith. The holy city must tumble into ruins, and the Latter-day Saints have indeed come to the latter day." Such creative writing. I can see the person who wrote that showing their editor how creative they've been. The problem was they were totally wrong. And what they didn't understand is that we cannot get another Joe Smith, but we can get a Brigham Young. And I love this picture of Brigham Young here, which was taken close to the time of the succession. Brigham Young was only 43 years old when Joseph Smith was killed. Just for context, I'm 45 years old right now at the filming of this video. And I just picture Brigham when something like this comes out saying, "You want to bet?" I heard a critic one time almost decrying who just didn't like the church saying, "Man, if after Joseph died, if you just wouldn't have had Brigham Young, Mormonism would have died out." And I think they may have been right. But Brigham was the person that God put in place. I am so bold as to say up front that Brigham Young was able to do things through his gifts, his talents, his temperament as well, that Joseph Smith was not able to do. And I'll talk a little bit more about that with you at the end of this. Well, let's talk about how did Brigham Young then become the rightful successor to Joseph Smith for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There's a wonderful article I'd invite you to read. It's called 6 Days in August by Ronald Walker. You can just Google it and find it and read it. It's very well written, very comprehensive, and goes into detail. I'm not going to summarize or recite the whole article to you, but a lot of what I'm going to summarize does come from that article here that I'd recommend you go read if you want more details on it. One of the questions, he calls it 6 Days in August because there was this period in the first week of August of 1844 where they really had to settle the succession question. In today's day and age where news comes immediately, remember after Joseph Smith was killed, there was not some immediate news cycle that let everybody know that Joseph had died. And most of the leadership of the church were out on missions. Sidney Rigdon happened to be in Pittsburgh. Joseph had sent him there to build up a branch of the church out in Pittsburgh. And Brigham Young and most of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, 8 of them, I believe, were out on missions at the time, helping with the political campaign of Joseph Smith for president. And when he was killed, it took weeks and weeks for the news to catch up. Brigham Young won't even learn that Joseph Smith has been killed until mid-July. And then it takes them a number of weeks to come back home. And so the succession question isn't really attacked and settled until the first week of August, even though Joseph Smith will be killed on June 27th. Well, what goes on? A little bit of what happens is the question of should it really be, originally it came down to, should it be Sidney Rigdon or should it be Brigham Young? Even though there were other viable options. You know, should it be William Marks and some of these others that I've mentioned, or probably Pratt or Willard Richards or William Smith. They knew that Joseph's son at the time, by the way, couldn't lead the church. He was only 12 or 13 years old. He was just a young boy. Well, when Rigdon hears that Joseph Smith has been killed, he's in Pittsburgh, and he immediately knows that there will be a succession question of who should be in charge. And Rigdon makes no qualms that he feels like he should be in charge. The word that he continually uses is that he should be the guardian of the church. He actually kind of wants to take control immediately, and he invites the apostles who are out east campaigning on their way back to Nauvoo to come to Pittsburgh to hold a meeting with him, almost kind of like controlling, like, I'm in charge, come to my place where I'm at to dictate the affairs. The 12 who are out on missions and here, they are able to communicate with Rigdon and say, no, we're going to go back to Nauvoo, where the body of the saints are, to settle this question, not come meet with you in Pittsburgh. So Sidney hurries and goes from Pittsburgh to Nauvoo as fast as he can. And he arrives in Pittsburgh, from Pittsburgh in Nauvoo before most of the 12 can return. When he gets there, there's only 4 members of the 12 who are in Nauvoo at the time. And they schedule a meeting, these 4 members of the 12, to meet with Sidney Rigdon. And Rigdon doesn't show up. to the meeting. The next morning, they're like, let's meet at 8 o'clock. Rigdon doesn't come. Parley P. Pratt goes out in the street to kind of find him, and he sees Rigdon just having random conversations with people and doesn't come to meet with the 12. We don't know why. It just seems that he didn't want to counsel and confer with the 12. And when Parley P. Pratt, who is a good friend with Sidney Rigdon, their days go all the way back before the church was even organized in the Campbellite movement. Rigdon basically says to Pratt, I'm talking to this person, I'll come. But then he ends up going away and says, I'm going to go to this meeting that's happening over here. There was a worship meeting happening at 10 o'clock in the morning, and Rigdon decides he wants to go there. Knowing, by the way, that the people at the meeting would want to hear from Rigdon. It's kind of his way, again, to kind of assert control. And Parley P. Pratt laments and says, we were left to counsel to ourselves, the four who were there without Rigdon. At that meeting, the people do want to hear what Rigdon has to say. And remember, Sidney Rigdon's a very eloquent speaker, very powerful speaker. And he has been leading as part of the leadership of the church for a long time. As a matter of fact, some people like to call the 1830s the Sidney Rigdon decade of the church, when he had a lot of influence. His influence began to wane in Nauvoo, however. Joseph did not turn to Sidney Rigdon in Nauvoo to be the leader of the church or the person he counseled with most often. As a matter of fact, Joseph began to distance himself from Sidney Rigdon, even at a time saying that Sidney Rigdon should no longer be in the First Presidency and that he didn't want him in the First Presidency. Joseph began to lean more and more and more in Nauvoo on the Quorum of the 12, and in particular on Brigham Young. He leaned more on them for not only leadership, but also ordinances, temple ordinances in particular, to receive them and perform them. So there was a gap that had grown between Rigdon and the 12. But when Rigdon showed up, these people wanted to hear what Rigdon had to say. At this meeting, at this 10 o'clock meeting, before the 12 is able to rejoin, Rigdon wants to call for a vote. He wants the saints to make a decision. And there has to be the 12 who are there have to say, no, we're not going to make a vote until all the 12 have returned, or a majority of them, and the 12 can help make the decision of where we should go with the church. We're not having you on your own to do it. But at that meeting, Rigdon speaks and says, quote, that he was the identical man that the ancient prophets had sung about, wrote, and rejoiced over, and that he was sent to do the identical work that had been the theme of all prophets in every preceding generation. He says that he received a vision where he was supposed to be the guardian of the church and build the church up unto Joseph, and that Rigdon said that he held the keys of this dispensation, that he would stand as God to the people, like Moses, and he would preserve the church as Joseph had begun it. That was kind of his claim. And Rigdon had a point, by the way. If you look at section 90 of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 6 and 16, it does say that Rigdon is equal with Joseph Smith in holding the keys of the kingdom. However, Rigdon did not seem to think that Joseph, being dead, released himself or relinquished himself as a counselor to Joseph. He still viewed himself as being in charge, or having that authority, or being Joseph's spokesman, so to speak, as section 100 said that he should be. After Sidney Rigdon got done, a few other people got up and spoke, and as one person was up in the middle of their talk, William Marks, the Nauvoo Stake president, interrupts them and says that on August 8th, President Rigdon wanted to hold a special meeting of the saints to consider Rigdon's claims. He wanted the succession question settled quickly, seemingly before the Quorum of the 12 could show up as a whole. Rigdon and William Marks had not consulted with the Quorum of the 12 apostles, the existing apostles, to hold that meeting, nor with any of the high council, or even with their own stake presidency. William Marks is the Nauvoo stake president. Well, so in all this, where was Brigham Young? Well, he was still out on his mission out east. He does not learn until July 16th that Joseph is killed, backing up a few days. He was with Orson Pratt. And there's that classic story of when he hears that Joseph Smith has been martyred, just a solemn, somber thing rests on him. And Brigham wonders if the keys of the kingdom have been taken. And he says, I felt, though, as I never felt before. There were no tears, but he says, my head felt as though my head would crack. And in his despair, finally, like a clap, Brigham says, the answer came to him that the keys of the kingdom are right here with the 12. And he brings his hand onto his knee to make the point. In particular, this is because Brigham and the 12 had met with Joseph. As I mentioned in the last video on the martyrdom, in March of 1844, Joseph had held a meeting with the Quorum of the 12 in what some have later called the last charge, where Joseph said, I roll the burden and responsibility of leading this church off my shoulders onto yours. Round up your shoulders and stand under it like men, for the Lord is going to let me rest a while. Now, what's interesting is even though this last charge took place with the 12, Joseph didn't identify Brigham as being the successor directly. That was not clear to anybody, but Brigham was the president of the 12 apostles at the time, and therefore the leading, presiding high priest over the 12. Now, one thing that I want to make clear right here, one note of succession. One of the reasons why I do believe Brigham and the 12 had the right to lead the church and not Sidney Rigdon has not only to do with the keys of the kingdom, but also with the ordinances of the kingdom. Remember, the power of godliness, as Section 84 says, is found in the ordinances thereof and the authority to perform them. And Joseph had turned to the 12, and Brigham Young in particular, to perform the highest temple ordinances that had been revealed. It was not Sidney Rigdon who was performing those. It was Brigham Young and the 12. In particular, Brigham Young and others of the 12 had received all the ordinances, all of them, all the temple ordinances. So the question that, and this maybe wasn't known because those who received the temple ordinances were a small select group, under 100 people, known as the anointed quorum. It wasn't necessarily public knowledge yet, but it was Brigham and the 12 who had received and who were giving all these ordinances to this smaller group of people. So in Brigham's mind, the question was not only who has had hands laid on their head, but also who had received all the ordinances and who could give all the ordinances of salvation and exaltation. And to him, the answer was clear. It was not Sidney Rigdon or William Marks or Joseph Smith III. It was the Quorum of the 12 Apostles where those keys rested. Everything that was necessary for the salvation of man is what Brigham recollected. This is the church history topics essay on this subject of succession and the church. Quote, most importantly, Joseph had entrusted a majority of the apostles with all the temple ordinances so that they could administer them to others. They now held not only the keys to build up the church in all the world, but also those associated with the temple, leaving them uniquely positioned to carry on these vital endeavors after Joseph's death. Well, by Thursday, August 8th, the majority of the 12 had finally got back to Nauvoo, including Brigham Young. And they decided to hold a meeting first thing at 8 in the morning to talk about what they want to do to handle this succession question, which is starting to turn into maybe a crisis. What's interesting is Brigham Young is so punctual. He's so responsible. And Brigham Young forgets to show up for their meeting. Now, Brigham will say, I would never do that. And he says, I will not let this go down in the history of the church. People like Anthony Sweat will not tell this in future videos. But Brigham, as people talked about it with him later, says, no. And Brigham goes, oh, maybe I did miss that meeting. As Ronald Walker says in his essay on this, maybe all the stress of the past had caught up to him, but it was a fortuitous forgetting of the meeting that morning. Because instead, he stumbles upon a meeting that is going on with Sidney Rigdon. Rigdon had organized a prayer meeting. And at that meeting, Rigdon was going to call for a vote. He wanted to get the church to vote. And Brigham just happens to roll over there to that meeting. Ronald Walker says, what would have happened? One of those events that would have changed maybe the course of history. Well, when Brigham gets there and he sees what Sidney's doing, he says, quote, I will manage this voting for Elder Rigdon. Brigham says, I didn't even ask for permission to speak. I just showed up when they were getting ready to do it. And I said, I'll manage this. And that must have been a shock to the saints because a lot of the saints in Nauvoo didn't know that Brigham was back in town or that the majority of the 12 were there. So suddenly they wanted to hear from Brigham too. And Brigham says, quote, he does not preside here, meaning Sidney Rigdon. This child, and that means himself, Brigham Young himself, will manage this flock for a season, is what Brigham says. Young complained to Rigdon and those who were there of a hurrying spirit and spoke of the true organization of the church, which required a formal vote by the people in a special seating arrangement, or what we might call a solemn assembly of the church. Anxious to forestall this meeting, Brigham Young says on the spot that they'll hold that meeting at 2 o'clock that same day. They're not going to wait for the coming week as they had planned. So that 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they organize this meeting to finally decide the question that's on so many people's mind. The meeting starts 45 minutes late as they're trying to get everybody together. There's about 6,000 Latter-day Saints there. Sidney Rigdon gets up and tries to preach, but the wind's blowing and boisterous, and his speech isn't very effective. His speech didn't carry the normal power that a Rigdon speech does. And when he sits down, others get up and speak. Also, Elder Amasa Lyman spoke at the meeting. Amasa Lyman had been appointed to take William Law's place in the First Presidency. And Amasa Lyman says he wanted the people to know that he didn't feel like he had any special claims just because he was Joseph's counselor. And he kind of aims that at Rigdon. As Ronald Walker says, Lyman's remarks were aimed at Rigdon. And then Walker says this: when it finally came time for Rigdon to defend his claims, he asked Elder W.W. Phelps to speak in his behalf. Rigdon's hour-and-a-half speech that morning had worn him out. The choice of Phelps was a disaster. Phelps stunningly defended the 12, as did the popular Parley P. Pratt a few moments later. After so much confusion and hand-reading during the past 6 days, the matter ended rather easily. Looking back, the reasons appear clear. There really was no viable alternative to the 12, is how Ronald Walker remembers it. Brigham Young did speak at the meeting. And some people say that Young was all over the place, but the main thing he was doing was he was attacking Sidney Rigdon. He, in essence, says, one report says that Brigham says, "Who are you counseling? You're Joseph's counselor. And if you want to continue to counsel Joseph, you need to go where Joseph has gone. You're not anybody's counselor anymore." Brigham says, quote, "The 12 were appointed by the finger of the Almighty. They were the independent body that, quote, held the keys of the kingdom of the whole world, so help me God." They were the church's new presidency. As Section 107 says, the 12 are equal in authority to the First Presidency. Brigham Young also points out and says, taking some aim at Rigdon, had Brigham ever faltered? Had his knees ever been feeble or weak? Pointing that sometimes Sidney Rigdon had. Sidney Rigdon had some falling out in the Kirtland period, saying that the keys of the kingdom had been lost and rent from Joseph, and Joseph didn't want him in the First Presidency, etc. Brigham says that Rigdon had lost his position because of his unfaithfulness. And this is where we get some of these accounts of Brigham being transformed or transfigured. A lot of these accounts do come later, but there are multiple accounts. Brigham remembers himself, quote, "The power of the priesthood sat upon me." And he felt like he could sling mountains as he was speaking at this succession voting meeting. This is how Ronald Walker remembers this, that the Brigham was transformed. He says, quote, "The idea that Young had been transformed or transfigured by the spirit of Joseph Smith became one of the great traditions of Latter-day Saint history. The story has been told many times with many variations. A recent compilation has more than 100 testimonies, 57 of them firsthand, and many written by men and women of ability and reputation. For some, the confirmation had been a feeling or a spiritual witness that they had felt during one of those long meetings on August 8th or in the days that came later. The version often used the word mantle to describe what they had seen, the symbolic cloak of the Old Testament prophet Elijah falling upon his successor Elisha. It was evident to the saints that the mantle of Joseph had fallen upon Young," said Wilford Woodruff less than a year later, "and the road that he pointed out could be seen so plainly," end of quote. Walker concludes that, quote, "Young himself never made any special claims about his transfiguration, beyond saying that on August 8th, he felt he had the Holy Ghost and the spirit of the prophets." And that seemed to settle the question. It just was clear to most people there that it was Brigham and the 12 who should lead the church, and not Sidney or anybody else. This is from the church's essay on the succession in the presidency. Quote, "Reassured that Joseph's mantle had fallen to Brigham Young, they voted overwhelmingly to sustain the 12 apostles as the church's leaders. During the next 3 years, Sidney Rigdon, James J. Strang, and other figures formed their own movements, each drawing away some church members. Most saints, however, followed the 12 apostles, helping to complete the Nauvoo Temple, receiving temple blessings, and participating in the migration west to what is now Utah. The Quorum of the 12 Apostles as a group led the church under the direction of Quorum President Brigham Young until 1847, when Young called counselors and reconstituted the First Presidency." Now, I want to bring you back to one of the questions I asked originally before I review with you succession in the church as a whole today. How is it that you know that Brigham Young was the rightful successor to Joseph Smith and not somebody else? To me, one of the questions does come back to the Holy Temple. Joseph had made the Holy Temple central to his prophetic ministry ever since June of 1831, ever since identifying a temple in Independence, Missouri, and then building one in Kirtland, and then identifying one in Far West, and then building the Nauvoo Temple and administering the temple endowment ceremonies in the red brick store and the old homestead and the mansion house and Brigham and the 12. And my question is, which of the churches today focus in on temples and temple ceremonies and temple ordinances? Who at the time was giving them and receiving them? And it was Brigham and the 12, as the temple stands as the symbol of Jesus Christ restored church in the latter days. The temple and the authority and the keys to perform those ordinances are one of the major testimonies to me that the 12, and Brigham Young as the president of the 12, were the rightful ones to continue on the keys of the kingdom that had been given to Joseph and the ordinances therein. Well, speaking of succession in the church, how does succession in the church work? Just a brief primer, if you take a look at these graphics. When the president of the church dies, the First Presidency is automatically dissolved now. There is no more First Presidency. The first and second counselor are released. They most often are members of the Quorum of the 12, which, by the way, they don't have to be. One thing I want to make clear also is that Sidney Rigdon was never ordained an apostle. He was never part of the apostleship, which we assume that because today most often counselors are almost always apostles. But Sidney Rigdon, William Law, Frederick G. Williams, people like that were not apostles that Joseph called in the First Presidency. So when the First Presidency dissolves and these apostles retake their seats in seniority in the Quorum of the 12 now becomes the governing body, highest body in the church. And therefore, the president of the Quorum of the 12 apostles is the presiding high priest over the church. And Brigham Young, as the presiding high priest, as the president of the 12 apostles, as I mentioned, led the church for 3 years before they ever reorganized the First Presidency. After John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff, they began to reorganize the First Presidency immediately. So what usually happens then is that a motion is made that by somebody in the quorum that the president of the 12 should be sustained as the new president of the church. That is then voted on, and then they lay their hands on their head. Usually this is from the church. After a discussion, a formal motion is made and accepted by the Quorum of the 12. If a motion to reorganize the First Presidency is passed, the Quorum of the 12 unanimously selects the new president of the church. The new president chooses 2 counselors, and the 3 of them become the new First Presidency. Throughout the history of the church, the longest-serving apostle has always become the president of the church when the First Presidency has been reorganized. Following the reorganization of the First Presidency, the apostle who has served the second longest is sustained as the president of the Quorum of the 12. When the second longest-serving apostle has also been called in the First Presidency as counselor, the third longest-serving apostle becomes acting president of the 12, which is what we have currently in the church with Russell M. Nelson as president, Dallin H. Oaks, who is technically the president of the 12 in the First Presidency, and therefore M. Russell Ballard is the acting president of the Quorum of the 12. The president of the Quorum of the 12, along with the rest of the apostles, sets apart the new president of the church through a formal laying on of hands. And that is how the new president is chosen. I love that idea because, in essence, it's saying that the way we get a new president of the church is, number one, through life and death, through who serves within the Quorum of the 12 as the longest tenured apostle, when they become the senior apostle through years of service and therefore the president of the 12. There's no electioneering, there's no campaigning that way. It's the president of the 12 who becomes the next president of the church. It's orderly, it's beautiful, it's simple, and it puts people in the church to lead the church now who have years and years and years of experience with it. Well, the other thing I want to touch on in this video are some of these other people who chose not to follow Brigham and the 12 West. I'd highly recommend this book. It's called Scattering of the Saints, Schism Within Mormonism. And you can see this graphic here. This is trying to represent, when this book was written, all the different break-offs of the church and where they broke off and how they broke off. There's so many, and I don't have time to give a quick summary. I do want to hit a few of them, though, and this graphic helps a little bit so you can see. Some of the breakoffs from the church, obviously the blue line is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints with Brigham Young that represents us and me. There is a breakoff from us, a primary breakoff that sometimes is known as fundamentalism, which is when our church decided at the turn of the century in the 1900s to quit the practice of plural marriage. And sometimes those are called FLDS, or Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, who believe as a premise that plural marriage never should have ceased in the church, and that Wilford Woodruff in particular and Joseph F. Smith were wrong to stop it in the church. We'll look at a few of these others. James Strang, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, no hyphen. He's the one who claimed to have a letter saying that Joseph had appointed him, had he died, to be the new leader of the church. And James Strang's very charismatic, and his life is fascinating if you want to read into him. He's going to take a group of people over to Michigan, onto Beaver Island eventually, and build up a large following of about 10,000 people there. However, he will be martyred and killed by some disgruntled followers, and his movement has mostly faded away. There's not very many Strangites or followers of James Strang left today. There's also, if you look at the green line, there's Granville Hedrick, who in essence breaks off from the Prairie Saints, who don't follow Brigham West. And Granville Hedrick receives a revelation that he feels like the church should be taken back to Independence, Missouri. And so they go back, and if you go to Independence, Missouri today, you'll see a little white building on the temple lot. And those are sometimes called Hedrickites, or their official name is the Church of Christ Temple Lot. The orange you see is Sidney Rigdon, who did lead his own church up into Pittsburgh. And Sidney Rigdon's church kind of came to an end, but there was a breakoff of Sidney Rigdon's church that continues today, the Church of Jesus Christ. Sometimes they're called Bickertonites because they were led by a man named William Bickerton. And there are many others, and I apologize that I'm not touching on all of them, but I want you to understand these main ones that are out there. The main one that the other largest restoration movement is the Community of Christ, or the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The reorganization really are from saints who didn't go west and didn't go follow Lyman White. I didn't even talk about him, who went down to Texas, but they kind of stayed in the Midwest, in Illinois and other places. And in the 1840s, they just kind of convalesced more. Emma Smith is part of them. She does not follow Brigham in the 12 West. I'll talk about her in a second. But in the 1850s, they say we should reorganize. We should regather. We should regroup. And two men, Jason Briggs and Zenas Gurley, are usually the ones credited with beginning the reorganization. Usually around 1852 is the year. They reach out to Emma Smith and invite her to be part of it, and especially her son, Joseph III, who they feel Joseph Smith's son should be the rightful leader of the church. And then at a conference in Amboy, Illinois on April 6, 1860, the reorganization unanimously accepts Joseph Smith's oldest son, Joseph III, as their prophet, seer, and revelator, and the successor to the church. Today, the Community of Christ is an international church that has a few 100,000 members, and their mission is, quote, to proclaim Jesus Christ and promote communities of joy, hope, love, and peace, end of quote. They are wonderful caretakers of so many things that we believe are valuable as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They've been wonderful caretakers and stewards of the Kirtland Temple, of the manuscript of the Joseph Smith translation, of the Mansion House, and so many others, so many things. We're so grateful to the Community of Christ, our brothers and sisters in the restoration there. And Emma Smith ends up affiliating with the Community of Christ, or what's called the Reorganized Church at the time, later known today as the Community of Christ. This is a good summary of Emma because a lot of people have questions about her, and I can't give a full summary of Emma Smith. I'd recommend Jennifer Reeder's new book called First, The Life and Faith of Emma Smith, if you want more expansive. But I do like this summary from Richard Bushman on Emma Smith in his book, Rough Stone Rolling. He says, quote, Emma's alienation from the main body of the church began almost immediately after the martyrdom. Joseph left behind 5 children. Emma thought immediately of her family's security. At issue was property. She wanted to preserve her assets from inclusion with the churches, a nearly impossible distinction to maintain. William Clayton felt she was grasping and unreasonable, and Brigham Young was suspicious. Uneasy in dealing with the powerful, willful woman, they left her out of their councils and even their socials. Her known opposition to plural marriage made her double troublesome. When most of the saints moved west, she stayed behind in Nauvoo. With Joseph gone from her life, Emma withdrew from religion. She was reluctant to talk about Mormonism. Eventually, the Reformed Mormons who ran the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, made up of saints who had not gone west, persuaded Joseph III to take the leadership. Emma joined but never took a leading role. I think it's important to say that Emma Smith was faithful to her testimony of Joseph Smith, his prophetic calling, the Book of Mormon, and the Restoration, her entire life, even though she admittedly didn't follow Brigham, didn't believe in Brigham as in his prophetic ministry either, and that they had problems with each other. But it's important to know that Emma Smith was faithful to what she believed was true and held true in particular to her testimony of the Book of Mormon and the Restoration as a whole. Well, let me just conclude, returning back to Brigham Young as we end. Brigham Young is sometimes he's called the modern Moses. He's going to end up leading roughly 70,000 saints westward. There's a statue of him at the U.S. Capitol where they call him one of the world's great colonizers. And Brigham Young, I mean, I just want to end with a few quotes just to understand him. As I said, that Brigham did things that I'm not sure that Joseph Smith could do in helping the church continue. So much of what we have in the church today is as a result of Brigham Young. Sometimes I like to say that Joseph Smith is like the visionary who saw the vision and brought forth the vision of the church. But Brigham Young is the CEO, or maybe he's the president of the company who actually makes the company profitable and actually makes it function and grow and work and become what it is today. One of my colleagues, Garrett Dirkmott, has written, quote, Joseph Smith is the reason why we believe the things we believe. But Brigham Young is the reason why a church exists in which we believe today. It's under Brigham Young that the church doesn't completely fall apart and dissipate. It's under Brigham Young that a core central location is made, a refuge where the church can become strong enough that it doesn't collapse. Then the message of Joseph Smith is able to be brought to the rest of the world. In some ways, I see Brigham Young as this almost Paul-like figure, in the sense that without Paul, it's hard to see how Christianity could have become a world religion. Without Brigham Young, it's very difficult to see how the church could have survived as anything other than a scattered, insignificant faith that counts its members in hundreds or thousands rather than millions. I think that's a wonderful summary from Professor Dirkmott on what Brigham Young did and his skills that he brought. I want to conclude with this quote from Jedediah M. Grant. As Brigham Young establishes the church out here and has maybe the largest family in America, becomes a president of the church and a governor, becomes one of the most interesting people in the history of the U.S., and as it says, one of its great colonizers. Back east, people take interest in Brigham Young. And Jedediah M. Grant writes this, quote, I can't undertake to explain Brigham Young to your Atlantic citizens or expect you to put him at his value. Your great men eastward are, to me, like your ivory and pearl-handled table knives, balanced handles, more shiny than the inside of my watch case, but with only edge enough to slice bread and cheese and help spoon victuals, and all alike by the dozen, one with another. Brigham is the article that sells out west with us, between a Roman cutlass and a beef butcher knife, the thing to cut up a deer or cut down an enemy, and that will save your life or carve your dinner every bit as well. Though the handpiece is buckhorn and the case a hogskin hanging in the breech of your pantaloons, you that judge men by the handle and sheath, how can I make you know a good blade? That question continues today in many ways. I bear my witness that the keys of the kingdom have continued from Joseph Smith through Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 down today to Russell M. Nelson as the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I believe it for many reasons, but most of it, to me, central question is the focus on the temple and the temple ordinances and the temple covenants that Joseph was so central on and that continues in the church today. I hope that you and I can continue in the restoration as those who followed Brigham Young after the death of Joseph Smith continued in it also. God bless you and me as we seek to do so.